Hello and welcome to another video by the Backup Chargers. It's been a little bit since our last one. Been kind of busy with competitive events along the way, but you're going to have a little bit of a fun one today. We're going to be doing a Looking Glass Water Neos Tenoris. There's a lot of stuff to get into. I'm going to do kind of a briefer overview than usual on the deck, and then go over some of my card decisions, etc. So without further ado, we are on Looking Glass. It's a good card. We have a few different engines we're relying on in the deck. It's going to look a little bit more similar to the Seru list in terms of what I'm doing with Looking Glass, but to better effect. Our lineage, we are looking at Spirit of Serene Water, Tony level 1, 2, and 3. Serene Water is really good here because we have a 36 health pool once we get here. Really helps with our survivability. We're not running that many water cards, so it works out pretty efficiently most of the time. For our card draw, we are looking at one copy of Backup Charger, one copy of Wayfinder's Map, and one copy of Chalice of Blood. So these three are very, very specific. You could run Baubles, you can't really cut the Looking Glass because of some other things in here, but you could look into other ways to draw cards, but these are the three best ones in my opinion. Backup Charger makes a token, which is very relevant for your endgame. Wayfinder's Map along the way can make your domains cheaper and will crack to draw in the late game if you don't really have a whole lot of development time, so it works out almost like a mid to late game GCR anyway. And then Chalice of Blood, you have 30 health with a Serene Spirit, hitting 20 damage in any typical game and then drawing 2 is just going to be really good, right? So these are the three card draw regalia that I recommend. They've been working for me really well. Next up for our kind of interference tools, I'm running Terrafring and Vaporjet Shield. Terrafring, pretty usual. Vaporjet Shield, it does cost 2, which can be really rough, but making so you take 1 less damage from everything until this gets removed by basically just Fracturize or Temporary Zephyr. Those are really the only easy ways to deal with this thing. Otherwise, you're just going to be sitting on this and your opponent's going to have to put in so much more work to actually deal any amount of damage to you. Then for our weapons, we're looking at one Inert Sword, because we are on Looking Glass, and one Archon Broadsword. Archon Broadsword is usually the easiest way to win the game. This will typically, the last game I won with this, I think I swung with this for 19 cleave, so that's usually more than enough to finish out the game, right? So that's it for the material deck. Everything's pretty tight with this, if I'm being honest. There's not a whole lot of room even for sideboarding, but I'll go over that at the very end. Up next, we'll go over the domain package. Like I said, it's going to look pretty similar to Seru because we are on Chamber of Reflections. That's why we need to have Looking Glass here. Running 3. I was on 4, but 4 is a little too clunky. You don't really want to see 2 at a time because you just don't need 2 of these in particular, right? We're looking at 2 copies of Mad Tea Party. It's searchable off chamber. You can just hard play it. The recover is very relevant, especially because we put multiple bodies out at once in the late game. So we're able to recover 3, 4, 6 a turn with this, as long as it stays out, which is really solid. 1 copy of Jucheng. We can natively play this because we are water until we crack it. And even then, as long as it's still in deck, we can find it off chamber, so it's still fine. Gloamspire is a lot more important, though. So Gloamspire, I wish did not draw the opponent. But other than that, it's kind of the main domain you want to find in this deck. The only time you don't want to bring it out is if you're against, Fiza, Philo, because giving them that early influence is really not great. You find it mid to late game, it's not the end of the world as long as you've kind of stabilized. So just bear that in mind. You don't want to bring it out too early if you don't know what you're playing against. But typically you'll know pretty quickly if they're on some kind of really aggro deck, right? And then for our last domains, we're running 3 copies of Dormant Sacrificial Altar. This just draws in a memory, has some utility against Stifle Traps, etc. Don't really need to worry about that part too much. This is all for the domains. We're not running that many considering we're on Tony. This is only 10 domains, which is a decent chunk, but not too much that's going to clog up your entire deck, right? Next up, we're going to go over the float. Got quite a bit of float in here despite not needing it necessarily. So 4 copies of Storm of Thorns. This is our interference card as well. We need lots of survivability. Storm of Thorns is just really good no matter what stage of the game you're in, as long as you're still able to activate it. This is one of the... In fact, these 8 cards are the only water cards in the main deck. So you're not missing out on much with Serene Spirit. 4 copies of Stalwart Shieldmate. So no 2 Taunt and Float. Nothing too special. 4 copies of Fastcure. I typically find myself activating Fastcure just for the actual recover. A lot more often than I thought I would, honestly. It's just a very good survivability piece. If you happen to have the float with it, then even better. 3 copies of Navigate the Streets. So this is very important. Weirdly enough, this is probably the best float in the deck because it is a glimpse that costs 1. You actually bottom the cards on like Idle Thoughts. And very importantly, you can chamber and navigate the streets going first on Serene Spirit with only 6 influence, while still having the float to go into level 1 without having to nag anymore. And then pre-rec get the Gloam Spire to just start your entire game plan. That's pretty much the best opener in the deck. Then for our last non-Neos card, well, not quite last non-Neos card, we're looking at 2 copies of Overpowering Defense. This is just to help with the late game being able to actually go for lethal. And then speaking of late game, the way we get there is with Dungeon Guide. It's a good card. Who knew, right? So Dungeon Guide just gets us to 3. You can use it to get to 2, but it does feel pretty bad. This isn't really the deck that can leverage that unless you have the Gloam Spire and you're just kind of dawdling along the way. Last non-advanced element card, although technically it is advanced, we have Looking Glass to get through though, is Cheshire Cat. We are able to run Inert Sword. It's able to clear early allies. It's a pretty solid inclusion. We're not running a lot of other allies, so it's probably the best one we can be playing, just to have something in play that can start clearing boards. If your opponent has Arthurs out and you can't deal with it, it's going to be a bad time. So Cheshire's really good. You don't necessarily have to have it. I know it had a big price spike recently. So if you want to, you can run something else other than the Cheshire, as long as it's something that can actually clear allies effectively. That is it for the basic element, norm, etc. Now we're going to go over Neos cards. There is quite a bit. We're running 25 Neos cards in here. So we're running 4 copies of Blade of Creation. This is one of your win cons. If your opponent tries to stealth himself, then you don't care because you're cleaving. Cost 7, costs 1 less for every token you control. I'll go over that in a little bit, but it's very strong. 4 copies of Atmos Armor Ares. This gets the Atmos Shield tokens. If you don't know what those do, I'll go over all the tokens afterwards. But it gives a lot of survivability, hits for 3 by itself, and you can kind of, there's ways you can make this even bigger and just chain them together and hit for a lot. 4 copies of Clockwork Amalgam. This is Ares copy 5 through 8. If your opponent doesn't have everything that you want, it is an extra copy of Archon Broadsword. If you are worried about running out of durability in a long game, it's another Inert Sword to buff Cheshire. This card is actually one of the best cards in Neos, and I don't know how I haven't thought of it before building this list, because it's actually insane. I have copied Majestic Spirits with it, I've copied Carders with it, because it copies even opponent stuff. It lets you kind of keep pace with the opponent no matter what they're doing, which is really good. 4 copies of Hector. The main reason we're running so much Neos cards is so that we can get the Imbue. If you don't imbue it, it's fine, but our main game plan is getting to 3. I figure let's lean into it and actually try to utilize the Hector if we can, right? So if it's imbued, you get 2 automaton drones, just some extra bodies. And it has a really neat protection effect that I'll go over a little bit. It's annoying to explain the interaction. It'll be best to explain when I have the whole board to go over. 3 copies of Throne Sentinel. Throne Sentinel is just a big taunt, can give Spell Shroud, can also buff allies. It's a good inclusion. It's really useful against Merlin and such, just to keep up some kind of Spell Shroud. 3 copies of Cordelia, my most hated card. But if you happen to have it mid to late game, you have a bunch of tokens already. I'm able to go Cordelia into a free Ares into something else, just by how they are able to change together, which is really nice. And lastly, 3 copies of Neosite. This is kind of the optional one. This is the latest inclusion. If you don't want to go quite as heavy on the Neos, you can cut this. I'm considering running Fracturize in here, honestly, so I might cut the Neosite for Fracturizes, but other than that, you don't really need too much more in this. So this is the list. We get the main, the material deck, the main deck. Lastly, I'll just quickly go over the sideboard. Just lay it over on top. So, shift it up. 3 copies of Song of Frost. Just negate attacks. Good against Diana, etc. 3 copies of Resolute Stand. This is for wide boards. 2 copies of Overpowering Defense. So that finishes the playset here. Just for when you're going against water, etc. So you can actually go for the kill. Their Song of Frost don't mean anything if you're negating it, right? 1 copy of Heavenly Guide. You can replace 1 Dungeon Guide with a Heavenly. After you sideboard, of course. But I recommend just having Heavenly as a 5th Dungeon Guide just in case. Because there are games where your opponent just doesn't find their Dungeon Guide. And you would rather at least have what would have been the Heavenly be the Dungeon Guide in that case. So that's my recommendation for it. And then 2 material deck cards in the sideboard are Orb of Sealing and Safeguard Amulet. Safeguard is against spell damage decks. Merlin, if you're worried about stratagem, etc. Really good. Orb of Sealing is good into the usual suspects. Slimes, Seiryu, CL. What I'm really worried about is the new kind of mill variety of CL using Grim Pastiche and Regal Inquisition. Because that's a little... I can't really interact with that too much, so having Orb is a really good way to stop them from being able to do that. Because this deck doesn't want to go long, so do they. I can usually have value, but if I can't stop their win con, and they can, then it comes down to them getting it, so Orb of Sealing is just for that. So that's it for the deck overview. I'm going to clear this away and go over some interactions and why I'm running cards and why I'm not. So, first of all, the domains. I know a lot of people like running Eternal Kingdom. I do not. Reason being, Tony is not fractals. You don't really have access to the damage cards, the negates, etc. that make it worth it to run the domains. At best, you have whatever little value you can get from the domains, plus making them reservable is kind of fine. For stuff like Dormant Altar, that's decent. Zhu Cheng Mad Tea Party could. But it just doesn't really contribute anything to the deck. If you are really insistent on it, you could add it as a little one-of of, hey, I'm happening to find this, increase the domain package by a little bit. Maybe add the 4th Sacrificial Altar, a couple Hub of Innovations. Kind of want to go neutral cards, and then you could go 4th Chamber to make it a little more consistent that way. Importantly, the other main reason why I don't like it is Chamber can't search Eternal Kingdom, because Eternal Kingdom costs 4, and Chamber only searches 3 or less. So, Eternal Kingdom is fine, it's just not really what I want to be doing. And then in terms of why I'm running this specific package, Globe Spire is a good value engine, so if your opponent's on Censor, you just don't care. You're just going to banish and you'll be happy with it. Zhu Cheng, good interference. It can slow down some decks. It's actually not bad in a fire aggro. You'd rather have the Mad Tea Party, but depending on what your opponent's hand size is early on, you could Zhu Cheng and just stop them from playing. And then for Dormant Altar, weirdly enough, this is pretty much the reason why I'm on the water version instead of fire. Because it costing 2 for the domain instead of 3 with Hub of Innovation is so much better. Especially with the Wayfinders map costing 1. It slots in a lot nicer. And then in addition, the sacrifice ability is technically relevant. So if your opponent's on Tristan and they have Stifle Traps, etc., you have this out and, any kind of automaton, it's pretty easy that you'll have something in play to stop their Stifle for at least an Ares. Because Ares is an automaton, so you can sacrifice itself plus one of your humans. Namely, it could be Hector, could be Cordelia. There's a few different options here. You could sacrifice Cheshire, Dungeon Guide, if you had a leftover Dungeon Guide. You can't really prevent the Dungeon Guide from going, though, because you don't really make automatons until you hit level 3, typically. Your domain can, but again, you have to be level 3. So Tony Genesis Aegis makes obelisks, That's his entire thing during the recollection phase. You basically get one of each of these until you have all three. You get to choose which order they are. You can't have duplicates. But essentially what happens is Obelisk of Protection. It can rest and prevent 2 damage to something. Armaments can rest and make a Ore Steel Greatsword. Obelisk of Fabrication can rest and make a Automaton Drone with a buff counter, so it makes 2/2s every turn, basically. Importantly, this costs 4 in resting, 5 in resting, 6 in resting. However, they all cost 1 less for every domain you control. And typically, by the time you have your level 3, you should have 1 to 2 domains out already, which is really nice because then, immediately this will only cost 1 to 2. Typically, same for this, depending on what you're using it. Choosing which one to bring out is one of the more complicated things because you don't always need to use it immediately. It's about how many cards you're leaving in hand for the follow-up turn, etc. So, in terms of Neos cards, these are the 4 best ones. Cordelia, Throne Sentinel, and Neosites are fine. Ares just slows down aggro matchups for an entire round. You have lots of interesting interactions with it. Namely, you have Clockwork Amalgam, which can enter as a copy of it to make more. Amalgam can then bounce back to hand. If you have a second Ares after that, play that, and then you play the same original Clockwork Amalgam. And then all of a sudden, those 3 cards were basically 4 copies of Ares. So 8 shields overall, which is really absurd. So the shields, for those that don't know, are insane. This is an Atmos shield. It is a 0/2 Automaton token ally. You can rest it to prevent 2 non-combat. And then whenever another Neos unit is attacked, you can redirect that attack to the shield. So if your opponent's attacking an Ares, redirect to the shield. If they're attacking your champion, redirect to the shield. If they're attacking Hector, I guess you can redirect, but the main thing is you just want to make sure that you kind of keep your board active. So shields are really good at that, and then especially with Hector. So Hector is kind of obnoxious. I already said it makes some tokens, but the big thing is that damage prevention is really good. So it has a second effect at the bottom, that really long line of text, that says if damage would be dealt to 1 or more non-token Neos units you control, prevent X of that damage or X is the amount of tokens you control, apply this replacement effect only once per turn. So that's not once per turn per object. That's once a turn you get that replacement effect on whatever it affects, right? So by itself, it's still pretty decent, but if your opponent has a board, it makes it a little bit harder. That's where cleaving beforehand comes in, so they don't have that established board. And then it's very easy to have 8 influence late game with Gloamspire, so you'll be able to play Ares and Hector in the same turn. When that happens, you'll have the Atmos shields active plus the Hector. And because it only affects non-token Neos cards, you can redirect to shields. They won't use up that replacement effect on anything that your opponent's doing. And then you can just let whatever their big chunk of damage is to go through and let that be affected by Hector so you don't take any damage. It's really easy to just not take 7-8 damage at a time using the Hector. And then Clockwork Amalgam, I went over some interactions already, but it becoming a copy of anything is really, really good. If you haven't tried out Clockwork Amalgam before, give it a try. I'm running 4 on this list because it's secretly one of the best Neos cards in the game, and I didn't realize it until I started playing this list. Blade of Creation, like I said, that's your win con. You want to use it just to actually cleave the board. You can use it to get over stealth. The biggest thing, too, is if you're playing against Tristan, the typical cleave you'll have access to is using an Ore Steel Greatsword, which is a token you make off of Tony, off of the Tony Obelisk of Fabrication. Sorry, of Obelisk of Armaments. So you'll be able to cleave for 7. 7 is exactly enough to just completely kill the Ominous Shadows. So you just kind of let them hang there with no way to prevent any more damage. So you'll cleave, then swing with Ares, etc., whatever you want to do. And along the way, the Greatsword counts as a token, the shield counts as a token, so with just that, this would only cost 5. And the big thing is the obelisks also count as, or are tokens, so they'll reduce the cost even more. Now, that's the deck. In terms of what you might want to change, you really have to figure out what your meta is. Personally, I think what I might change is I might swap out Neosites for Fracture Rises, again, just to kind of deal with early sensors. It doesn't hurt too much, but when you have 2 or 3 floats sitting in the graveyard, you'd much rather just be able to use it. You don't really want to Fracturize your own backup, your own power cell, because you actually like having the token, but other than that, there's not a whole lot I'd change. Maybe bring in the Resolutes from side to main, swap something out. But the list feels pretty solid. I definitely recommend giving it a try. If you have any questions for me other than what I already discussed in the video, feel free to comment down below. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye.